The Arab-Israeli War of 1948 began at the moment one state declared independence and several neighboring armies crossed its borders. But like many wars, its origins reached back decades before the first large-scale battles were fought. It was a conflict shaped by empire, migration, nationalism, fear, and competing promises made during a time of global upheaval. To understand the war, it is necessary to go back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when new national movements were forming across Europe and the Middle East. Among European Jews, a political movement known as Zionism emerged. Its goal was the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the historic land of Palestine, where Jewish communities had ancient roots but had lived as a minority for many centuries. At the same time, Arab nationalism was developing among Arabic-speaking populations who had long lived under Ottoman rule and sought independence and unity. Before the First World War, the region known as Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. Its population was mostly Arab, Muslim, and Christian, with a smaller Jewish community. During the war, the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary and was eventually defeated. As the empire collapsed, Britain gained control over Palestine under a system known as the Mandate, granted by the League of Nations in 1922. During the First World War, British officials had made several promises. In one communication known as the Balfour Declaration of 1917, Britain expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while also stating that the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities should not be prejudiced. At the same time, Arab leaders have been given assurances that they would gain independence in lands formerly ruled by the Ottomans. These overlapping promises created expectations that were difficult to reconcile. During the years of the British Mandate, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased, particularly during the 1920s and 1930s. Many Jews fled rising anti-Semitism in Europe, especially as Nazi persecution intensified in the 1930s. Land purchases and settlement expanded. Arab communities, who formed the majority of the population, grew increasingly concerned about displacement and political marginalization. Tensions between Jewish and Arab communities rose steadily. There were outbreaks of violence in 1921, 1929, and during the Arab Revolt between 1936 and 1939. The revolt was a large-scale uprising by Palestinian Arabs against British rule and Jewish immigration. Britain responded with military force and also attempted to limit Jewish immigration in later years. The Second World War transformed the situation further. The Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews were murdered by Nazi Germany, created deep global sympathy for Jewish survivors seeking refuge. After 1945, displaced persons camps in Europe held many Jews who could not or would not return to their former homes. Pressure increased for a solution in Palestine. By the late 1940s, Britain found the situation in Palestine increasingly difficult to manage. Violence between Jewish paramilitary groups, Arab fighters, and British forces escalated. Britain decided to refer the issue to the newly formed United Nations. In November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted on a partition plan. The proposal recommended dividing Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem placed under international administration. The plan allocated a larger portion of land to the proposed Jewish state, although Jews were still a minority of the total population. Jewish leaders accepted the plan, seeing it as a basis for statehood. Arab leaders rejected it, arguing that it was unfair and violated the rights of the Arab majority. Almost immediately after the UN vote, violence erupted between Jewish and Arab communities within Palestine. This first phase of the war, often called the Civil War phase, lasted from late 1947 until May 1948. Fighting occurred along roads, in mixed cities, and in rural areas. Both sides sought to secure territory before the British withdrawal. Jewish military organizations, including the Haganah, the Palmach, and smaller groups such as Irgun and Lehi, began coordinated operations to secure strategic areas. Arab forces were less centralized, consisting of local militias and volunteers from neighboring countries. Control over roads and supply routes became critical, especially access to Jerusalem. During this period, several towns and villages changed hands. Civilians were increasingly affected. Fear spread among communities. In some cases, entire populations fled advancing forces. One of the most widely known incidents occurred in April 1948 at Deir Yassin, where over 100 Arab villagers were killed by Jewish paramilitary fighters. The event had a powerful psychological impact and contributed to the flight of Arab civilians from other areas. By the spring of 1948, Jewish forces had gained significant territory beyond what the UN partition plan had originally assigned. Meanwhile, British forces prepared to leave Palestine. Their mandate officially ended at midnight on May 14, 1948. On that same day, David Ben-Gurion, leader of the Jewish Agency, declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The declaration stated that the Jewish people were exercising their natural and historic right to self-determination. The United States recognized the new state shortly afterward, followed by the Soviet Union. Within hours of the declaration, armies from neighboring Arab states Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq entered the former Mandate territory. What had been an internal civil conflict now became a full-scale interstate war. The Arab government stated that they were intervening to support the Palestinian Arabs and to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state. Each country, however, also had its own political interests. Transjordan, led by King Abdullah, aimed to control the West Bank. Egypt sought influence in Gaza. Coordination among Arab armies was limited. The Israeli forces, reorganized into the Israel Defense Forces in late May 1948, faced multiple fronts. Despite being newly formed, they were relatively well organized and had secured weapons through various channels, including shipments from Czechoslovakia. Fighting intensified through the summer and autumn of 1948. Battles were fought in Jerusalem, along the coastal plain, in the Galilee, and in the Negev Desert. Temporary ceasefires were arranged by the United Nations, but hostilities resumed several times. As the war progressed, Israeli forces gradually expanded their control. By early 1949, armistice agreements were signed separately between Israel and Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. These agreements established ceasefire lines, often called the Green Line, which would remain in place until 1967. By the end of the war, Israel controlled more territory than had been allocated under the original UN partition plan. The West Bank came under Jordanian control, and the Gaza Strip under Egyptian administration. For Palestinians, the war marked a profound and painful turning point. Approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs became refugees, leaving or being expelled from their homes during the conflict. Many settled in neighboring countries or in Gaza and the West Bank, often in temporary camps that became long-term communities. Palestinians refer to this period as the Nakba, meaning catastrophe. For Israelis, the war is remembered as the War of Independence, a struggle for survival against surrounding armies. For Palestinians and many in the Arab world, it is remembered as a moment of dispossession and loss. The Arab-Israeli War of 1948 did not resolve the deeper issues between the two peoples. Instead, it laid the foundation for future wars in 1956, 1967, and 1973, as well as decades of ongoing conflict. What began as a dispute over partition and national aspirations became one of the most enduring conflicts of the modern era, shaping the politics of the Middle East for generations to come. When the neighboring Arab armies entered the former British Mandate territory in May 1948, the war entered a new and more organized phase. What had begun as civil conflict between communities now became a conventional war fought between states. Yet even with the arrival of regular armies, the conflict remained complex, fragmented, and shaped by differing goals among the Arab countries themselves. The Egyptian army advanced northward from the Sinai Peninsula along the Mediterranean coast toward the southern coastal cities. Another Egyptian column moved eastward into the Negev Desert. Transjordan's Arab Legion, widely considered the most disciplined and effective of the Arab forces, crossed the Jordan River, and moved into the Central Highlands, including East Jerusalem and the area that would later be known as the West Bank. Syrian forces entered from the northeast near the Sea of Galilee. Iraqi troops joined operations in the Central Front, while smaller Lebanese units operated in the north. For Israel, the situation was precarious. The new state had declared independence only hours before the invasion began. Its army, the Israel Defense Forces, had been hastily formed by merging several pre-existing Jewish military organizations. It faced shortages of heavy weapons, armored vehicles, and aircraft. Many of its soldiers were recent immigrants or survivors of the Holocaust who had arrived only months earlier. Yet the Israeli leadership moved quickly to organize defenses and establish unified command structures. The first weeks of interstate fighting were intense and uncertain. In Jerusalem, heavy combat broke out between Israeli forces and the Arab Legion. The city held deep religious and symbolic importance for Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. West Jerusalem came under Israeli control, while the Old City and East Jerusalem were captured by the Arab Legion. Jewish residents of the Old City were expelled, and access to holy sites became restricted. The division of Jerusalem would remain one of the most sensitive and contested outcomes of the war. Along the coastal front, Egyptian forces initially made gains, capturing several settlements and pushing northward. However, Israeli forces gradually stabilized the front lines. In the north, fighting between Israeli and Syrian units centered around strategic hills and villages overlooking the Sea of Galilee. The United Nations attempted to intervene diplomatically. In June 1948, a temporary truce was arranged. During this pause in fighting, both sides sought to strengthen their positions. Israel used the ceasefire to import additional arms, particularly for Czechoslovakia. These shipments included rifles, machine guns, artillery, and aircraft, which significantly improved Israeli military capacity. Arab states also attempted to reorganize and resupply, though coordination among them remained limited. When fighting resumed in July, Israeli forces launched several offensives aimed at securing strategic corridors and expanding territory beyond vulnerable positions. One major objective was to secure the road to Jerusalem, which had been under threat during earlier fighting. Operations in central and northern regions resulted in the capture of key towns such as Lydda and Ramel. During these operations, many Arab residents fled or were expelled, contributing further to the growing refugee crisis. In the north, Israeli forces pushed toward the Galilee region. By late October 1948, operations in the Upper Galilee resulted in Israeli control over most of the area. Syrian and Lebanese forces withdrew across international borders. In the south, Israeli offensives in the Negev desert gradually isolated Egyptian units and forced them into defensive positions around the Gaza Strip and along the coast. Throughout these months, civilian displacement accelerated. Entire Arab villages were emptied. Some residents fled due to fear of fighting or reports of earlier violence. Others were directly expelled during military operations. By the end of the war, an estimated 700,000 Palestinians had left or been forced from their homes. Many crossed into neighboring Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, or moved into Gaza. Their villages were often destroyed or repopulated. At the same time, Jewish communities in areas captured by Arab forces also faced displacement. In addition to the expulsion of Jewish residents from the Old City of Jerusalem, some settlements in the West Bank and Gaza were abandoned during fighting. The war deepened mistrust and hardened narratives on both sides. Diplomatic efforts continued alongside military campaigns. A United Nations mediator, Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden, attempted to negotiate a lasting settlement. He proposed revised territorial arrangements and international control of Jerusalem. In September 1948, Bernadotte was assassinated in Jerusalem by members of a Jewish extremist group opposed to his proposals. His death shocked the international community and underscored the volatility of the situation. By late 1948, Israeli forces had gained the upper hand in most sectors. The Egyptian army was largely confined to the Gaza Strip. The Arab Legion maintained control over the West Bank and East Jerusalem, but did not push further west. Iraqi forces withdrew eastward. Syria retained small positions near the border, but had limited capacity for renewed offensives. Armistice negotiations were conducted separately between Israel and each neighboring state. These talks took place on the island of Rhodes under United Nations supervision. In early 1949, agreements were signed with Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. These agreements established ceasefire lines rather than permanent borders. The lines became known as the Green Line because they were marked in green ink on maps used during negotiations. Under these armistice agreements, Israel controlled approximately 78% of the territory of the former British Mandate, more than had been allocated under the original United Nations partition plan. Jordan formally annexed the West Bank and East Jerusalem, though this move was recognized by only a few countries. Egypt assumed administrative control of the Gaza Strip, but did not annex it. The refugee issue remained unresolved. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians lived in camps administered by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, established in 1949. Many believed their displacement would be temporary and that they would soon return to their homes. Israel, however, did not permit most refugees to return, citing security concerns and demographic considerations. The right of return became a central and enduring point of dispute. The war reshaped the political landscape of the Middle East. For Israel, survival against multiple invading armies reinforced a sense of national unity and resilience. For Arab states, the defeat was deeply humiliating and contributed to internal political upheaval in subsequent years. In Egypt, dissatisfaction with the monarchy and the outcome of the war would help fuel the revolution of 1952. The Arab-Israeli War of 1948 did not end the conflict between Jews and Arabs in the region. Instead, it created a new reality defined by armistice lines, refugee populations, and unresolved questions about borders and sovereignty. It set the stage for future confrontations and decades of diplomatic efforts that would seek, often unsuccessfully, to bring lasting peace. By the time the armistice agreements were signed in 1949, the guns had largely fallen silent. Yet the deeper consequences of the war were only beginning to unfold. The conflict had redrawn maps, displaced populations, and reshaped identities across the Middle East. What remained was a fragile ceasefire rather than a comprehensive peace. The armistice lines established between Israel and its neighbors were never intended to be final borders. They were military ceasefire lines drawn where armies had stopped fighting. Nevertheless, these lines defined political realities for nearly 2 decades. Israel controlled a larger area than originally proposed by the United Nations partition plan. Jordan held the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Egypt administered the Gaza Strip. No independent Palestinian state emerged from the war. For Palestinians, the aftermath was marked by displacement and uncertainty. Approximately 700,000 refugees were living in camps in the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Many families believed their exile would be temporary. Keys to abandoned homes were carefully preserved. Deeds to land were safeguarded. Yet as months turned into years, temporary shelters became permanent camps. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency began providing food, education, and medical assistance to the refugees. Generations would grow up in these camps, shaped by memories of villages they had never seen, but whose names were repeated in stories and songs. The refugee issue became central to Palestinian identity and political aspirations. Inside Israel, the new state faced immense challenges of its own. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants arrived in the early 1950s, including Holocaust survivors from Europe and Jewish communities from Arab countries such as Iraq, Yemen, Egypt, and Morocco. Many of these Jewish communities left or were expelled amid rising tensions in the Arab world after the war. Israel had to absorb this rapid influx while building infrastructure, housing, and a functioning economy. The memory of the war shaped Israeli society deeply. It was remembered as a war of survival fought against overwhelming odds. The term War of Independence reflected the belief that the state's existence had been secured through sacrifice and determination. Military service became a central element of national identity. In the Arab world, the defeat was often referred to as the Nakba, meaning catastrophe. The loss of Palestine was seen not only as a territorial setback, but as a failure of leadership and unity among Arab states. Public anger and disillusionment contributed to political change. In Egypt, dissatisfaction with King Farouk and the conduct of the war helped create conditions for the Free Officers Movement, which overthrew the monarchy in 1952 and eventually brought Gamal Abdel Nasser to power. The borders created by the armistice agreements were tense and unstable. There were frequent incidents along the ceasefire lines. Infiltration, retaliation raids, and skirmishes occurred throughout the early 1950s. Palestinian Fedayeen groups carried out attacks inside Israel, while Israeli forces conducted cross-border reprisals. The absence of a formal peace treaty meant that the conflict remained unresolved. Jerusalem remained divided. Barbed wire and fortified positions cut through neighborhoods. Families were separated. Access to religious holy sites was restricted depending on which side controlled them. The division of the city symbolized the broader division of the land. International diplomacy continued, but deep mistrust persisted. The core issues borders, refugees, recognition, and security remained unresolved. Each side developed narratives shaped by trauma and memory. For Israelis, the war confirmed the necessity of a secure Jewish homeland after centuries of persecution culminating in the Holocaust. For Palestinians, it marked dispossession and the loss of homeland. The War of 1948 also altered regional alliances and global politics. The emerging Cold War influenced the Middle East. Both the United States and the Soviet Union initially recognized Israel, but over time geopolitical alignments shifted. Arab states sought military modernization and external support. Israel invested heavily in building a capable and disciplined military. In 1956, tensions would erupt again in the Suez Crisis when Israel, Britain, and France attacked Egypt following Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. Later wars in 1967 and 1973 would further reshape borders and deepen the conflict. Yet the origins of these later confrontations lay in the unresolved outcomes of 1948. The Arab-Israeli War of 1948 was not simply a conventional war between armies. It was also a foundational event in the national stories of two peoples. It created a state for one and statelessness for another. It transformed local disputes into an enduring international issue. Even the years immediately following the war, both societies continued to evolve. Israel developed democratic institutions, though under conditions of ongoing military tension. Palestinian political organization gradually shifted toward independent movements seeking self-determination. Refugee camps became centers of social and political life. The landscape itself bore the marks of the conflict. Abandoned villages stood silent. New towns were constructed. Borders were patrolled. Roads that once connected communities were closed. Maps were redrawn in textbooks and government offices. As the 1950s progressed, it became clear that 1948 had not concluded a conflict, but had defined its framework. The ceasefire lines froze a moment in time, but they did not resolve competing claims to land, history, and identity. In calm reflection, one can see that the war's legacy lies not only in territory gained or lost, but in the enduring narratives formed during those months of fighting. These narratives would guide politics, diplomacy, and conflict for generations. By the early 1950s, the immediate battles of the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 had faded into uneasy silence. Yet the consequences of that conflict continued to shape daily life across the region. Armistice lines were guarded by soldiers who understood that they were standing not at permanent borders, but at pauses in a struggle that had not been fully resolved. The war had created a new political reality, but it had not created reconciliation. For Israel, statehood meant both security and vulnerability. Independence had been declared and defended, Yet the memory of invasion remained vivid. The leadership focused heavily on defense preparedness. Military institutions were strengthened, intelligence networks expanded, and alliances cautiously pursued. The young state invested in agriculture, industry, and infrastructure, while simultaneously preparing for the possibility of renewed war. For Palestinians, the years after 1948 were marked by dispersion and adaptation. Refugee camps in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria developed into tightly woven communities. International aid provided basic services, but economic opportunities were limited. Political organization evolved gradually as Palestinians sought ways to express national identity without an independent state. The memory of lost villages, orchards, and city neighborhoods became central to collective consciousness. In Jordan, the annexation of the West Bank created a new demographic balance within the kingdom. In Gaza, Egyptian administration provided governance, but not sovereignty. Neither territory became an independent Palestinian state, leaving the political question unresolved. Arab governments publicly committed to reversing the outcome of 1948, yet they often disagreed on strategy and priorities. Jerusalem remained divided. Its eastern and western have separated by barbed wire and checkpoints. Religious and historical sites were accessible to some and closed to others. The city's division symbolized the broader fragmentation of the land. The war also influenced Jewish communities beyond Israel's borders. In several Arab countries, long-established Jewish populations faced rising suspicion and hostility. Many immigrated to Israel during the late 1940s and early 1950s, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes under pressure. These migrations reshaped both Israeli society and the social fabric of Middle Eastern cities that had once been religiously diverse. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the refugee question and establish permanent borders encountered deep mistrust. Proposals for limited repatriation or compensation were debated, but never fully implemented. Each side feared that compromise might threaten its security or legitimacy. The broader Middle East entered a period of transformation. Nationalist movements gained strength. Colonial influence declined. Military coups and revolutions altered governments. The unresolved conflict with Israel became intertwined with regional politics, ideology, and identity. When future wars erupted in 1956, 1967, and 1973, they were often framed as continuations of the struggle that began in 1948. The armistice lines drawn in green ink became the reference point for later negotiations and disputes. The question of Palestinian statehood remained central to international diplomacy. Looking back calmly, the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 can be understood as a foundational conflict. It marked the end of British imperial administration in Palestine and the birth of the State of Israel. It also marked the displacement of a large Palestinian population and the beginning of a prolonged refugee crisis. It was both a war of independence and a war of loss, depending on perspective. The human dimension of the war is often found in personal stories. Families who rebuilt their lives in new towns. Families who waited in camps for a return that did not come. Soldiers who believed they were defending survival. Civilians who feared advancing armies. These experiences formed memories that would be passed quietly from one generation to the next. History rarely offers simple endings. The events of 1948 created a reality that has endured for decades, shaped by shifting politics, but anchored in the outcomes of that year. The war did not resolve competing national aspirations. Instead, it set the stage upon which those aspirations would continue to confront one another. In quiet reflection, one can see the war not only as a sequence of military operations, but as a moment when two powerful movements for self-determination collided within the same land. The consequences were profound and lasting. And so this story closes not with triumph or despair, but with recognition. Recognition that the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 reshaped the Middle East in ways still visible today. Recognition that its legacy lives on in borders, in refugee communities, in political debates, and in the enduring search for security and justice. The echoes of that year continue to move through history, reminding us that the past is never entirely distant. It remains present in memory, in identity, and in the continuing effort to find a path toward lasting peace.